Most people have no idea what really happened in this latest Minnesota clash between Donald Trump, Ilhan Omar, and a storm of fraud allegations swirling around the Somali American community. They think this was just another round of Trump attacks. Omar fires back, supporters argue online. A headline skirmish, a culture war flare-up, case closed. But what you're about to see is something entirely different, because this wasn't just about fraud. It wasn't about Somalia, and it definitely wasn't about a single congresswoman trading barbs with a former president. This was narrative repositioning, um, a recalibration of political identities, a test run for a bigger strategic shift that almost no one recognized in real time. Because beneath the shouting, the accusations, the viral clips, and the heated commentary, a more calculated game was playing out. And when you connect Omar's defensive posture with Trump's aggressive framing and then layer in the timing of multiple fraud cases breaking at once, the board suddenly looks different. The board just tilted. Let me show you what everyone missed. A narrator in the video lays out a dramatic chain of claims. Taxpayer funds in Minnesota, routed through various state-supported programs, particularly autism services, housing stabilization efforts, and lunch meal programs allegedly being siphoned off by fraud rings. He ties this to remittances sent abroad through money transfer networks. Some commentary clips claim that certain remittance corridors have, in unrelated cases, intersected with actors linked to extremist groups abroad. Into this inflammatory stew enters Representative Ilhan Omar. A clip shows her sharply criticizing what she calls blatant misinformation pushed by Donald Trump and his allies. She insists the accusations tying taxpayer fraud to terrorism are not supported by credible evidence. She frames the claims as politically motivated narratives that make the country look ignorant, and she emphasizes that Americans are better than that. The narrator interprets her pushback as fear, either fear of the allegations themselves or fear of the political momentum behind them. Then comes Trump's response. Asked about Somali immigrants, he characterizes the community broadly as ripping us off, argues that refugee resettlement from Somalia should stop, and says the U.S. is removing individuals he claims are nothing but trouble. He expands beyond specific fraud cases into a sweeping critique of Somali migration as a whole. Meanwhile, legitimate fraud cases have been prosecuted in Minnesota, most prominently the Feeding Our Future scandal, involving a multi-million-dollar meals program scheme. Multiple individuals were charged. Some commentators in the video point out that Omar referred to one person, while the indictment spanned many more. These events, clips, and commentary segments collided at the same moment. And the question becomes, why did this blow up now, and why does it matter politically? In politics, at this level, very little happens by accident. To understand what's really happening here, you need to understand the players, the patterns, and the long-running tensions that form the backdrop. Ilhan Omar has been a lightning rod in American politics since she arrived in Congress, praised by supporters as a progressive trailblazer, condemned by critics as controversial, polarizing, and too closely aligned with ideological frameworks that clash with mainstream American politics. Depending on where you sit, she's either a symbol of representation or a symbol of everything wrong with the political moment. There is rarely a middle ground with Omar. Trump, meanwhile, knows exactly what triggers media cycles and re-energizes his base. Immigration, national identity, and accusations of government waste are some of his strongest narrative weapons. Whenever he highlights fraud, especially involving immigrant communities, it activates his core coalition instantly. The landscape matters here. Minnesota has, over the years, seen several high-profile fraud cases involving state or federal funds. The Feeding Our Future case was enormous, tens of millions misappropriated through shell organizations in a meals program designed to help children. That case alone created an environment where any mention of fraud in Minnesota triggers immediate public reaction, even if the specifics differ. But there's a timing pressure here too. Several fraud cases and investigative reports surfaced or were amplified around the same period, particularly investigations into rapid cost spikes in autism-related services and housing stabilization programs. When programs grow from relatively small line items to hundreds of millions in just a few years, journalists, politicians, and commentators start paying attention. It creates a perfect environment for narrative escalation. There's also the remittance dynamic. Remittances are a legitimate, normal part of immigrant life worldwide. Somali diaspora communities send billions globally, and these flows can be crucial lifelines. But anytime remittances intersect with headlines about fraud, the political vulnerability increases. Even if the vast majority of remittances are lawful, the optics become combustible. And here's where everything gets interesting. This wasn't just a story about fraud. It wasn't even a story about Omar versus Trump. It was a story about competing narratives trying to claim the same spotlight at the same moment. One side trying to frame the issue as xenophobic misinformation, the other framing it as evidence of systemic failure and political hypocrisy. Judging by both Omar's defensive tone and Trump's aggressive escalation, both sides understood the stakes. So, what's really happening here? Because the surface story fraud allegations, immigration rhetoric, media commentary misses the deeper game entirely. The question isn't whether the fraud cases justify broad generalizations. The question is whether this confrontation was ever about the fraud cases at all. Here's what nobody is saying: this clash wasn't about evidence, it was about political territory. It was about narrative possession, and both players reached for the same weapon at the same time. Think about it strategically. If you are Ilhan Omar, you know two things: fraud. Fraud cases in your state, even if unrelated to you, strengthen your opponent's narratives. Two, you cannot allow those cases to define your identity or your community, because once a narrative is cemented, it's nearly impossible to reverse. So what do? You go on offense rhetorically, not empirically. You frame the claims as lies, misinformation, and xenophobia. You shift the battlefield from facts of fraud cases to morality of rhetoric, because that's where your political strength is. Path A, the obvious one, would be to debate every allegation head on, fact check every claim, audit every program. That would keep the conversation on the terrain your opponents want. Is there fraud? How much? Who's responsible? All of which turn into political quicksand. Path B, the 4D chess move, is to reposition the argument entirely. Make the story about bigotry, misinformation, and America's values. If you succeed, you win, even if you haven't disproven specific allegations, because the frame now favors your side. Now flip the board. If you are Trump, you know, one, immigration and fraud are two of your strongest mobilizers. Two, Omar is one of your most potent contrast figures. Three, any real fraud cases, even if isolated, give you an opening to expand the narrative. So what do? You take a narrow conversation about specific fraud rings and broaden it into a sweeping national security and cultural identity debate, not because the facts require it, but because the politics reward it. This is where the strategy becomes visible. Trump reframed the fraud cases as evidence of systemic immigrant risk, which reframes Omar's defense as self-interested denial, which reframes the 2024 over 2025 political map around trust, safety, and national identity. And now the enumerated wins. First, he set the agenda. Everyone responded to his comments, not the fraud reports themselves. Second, he tied Minnesota, a state Democrats consider safe, into his broader case that traditional blue states are vulnerable due to poor governance. Third, he reactivated his base with a familiar narrative: corruption, border weakness, immigration chaos. Fourth, and most importantly, he positioned Omar again as a symbol, a character in the story, not as an individual arguing policy. And then comes the coordinated web, because while everyone was watching the Omar clips, three things happened almost simultaneously. One, coverage of the Feeding Our Future sentencing resurfaced. Two, new reporting on skyrocketing autism service costs went viral. Three, commentators circulated older clips about remittances and clan politics. Were these coordinated politically? No, but the effect was indistinguishable from coordination. A narrative cascade began. First, the fraud cases re-entered the media stream. Then Trump amplified the broader immigration angle. Then Omar's rebuttal gave the story a face. Then commentators added ideological fuel. By the end of the cycle, Omar wasn't shaping the narrative, she was reacting to it. And in narrative warfare, reaction is weakness. This wasn't about fraud. It was about who controls the frame. So what happens next? Because this isn't the end, it's the opening move of a longer campaign. Here's what I see coming. First, in the next 60, 90 days, Expect Republican strategists to push Minnesota fraud cases into national messaging, not the details, the symbolism. Broken programs, lax oversight, weak Democrats, imported corruption. Even unrelated cases will be linked rhetorically. This likely escalates during any major Trump rally in the Midwest. It probably won't shift Minnesota red, but it will shape national perceptions of Democratic governance. Second, watch the remittance narrative. No mainstream politician will touch remittances directly, too risky, too easily misinterpreted. But journalists will think investigative breakdowns, think where does the money go, think flowcharts. This will create pressure on legislators to propose transparency measures, expect hearings within 6 months, framed as oversight, not immigration control. Third, expect Omar to initiate a narrative counteroffensive. This will likely take the form of policy proposals focused on fraud prevention, safeguarding benefits, and modernizing program oversight. The goal won't be legislative success, it will be repositioning. She'll aim to appear proactive, responsible, and solutions-oriented to neutralize the defensive and evasive image created by the current cycle. Fourth, the wild card. The Feeding Our Future scandal is still producing sentencing waves. If a major defendant cooperates with investigators, or if a new fraud ring surfaces, the narrative re-erupts instantly. Not because Omar is involved, she isn't, but because the public conflation is too powerful. Democrats' challenge is to separate legitimate fraud prosecutions from broad cultural narratives. Republicans' incentive is to merge them. Here's the deeper trend. We are entering an era where narrative density matters more than narrative accuracy, where multiple overlapping storylines reinforce each other, giving political arguments emotional weight that exceeds factual contours. 5 years from now, people won't remember the exact fraud cases. They'll remember the story. Minnesota, fraud, immigrants, Omar, true or not, precise or not, nuanced or not, the narratives that stick are the ones repeated. And that's what this moment really signals. The battlefield is no longer policy, it's narrative authority. So what does all of this mean for you? Here's the real lesson, the one that goes beyond Omar, Trump, Minnesota, or any single fraud case. Power isn't about facts. It isn't about who's right. It isn't about who has more data. Power in complex systems is about controlling the narrative frame. You just watched a perfect example. A fraud scandal surfaced. A national figure responded. A congresswoman pushed back. Commentators escalated. Clips resurfaced. Remittance debates reappeared. Programs unrelated to Somalia suddenly became part of the same rhetorical ecosystem. None of that happened because the facts demanded it. It happened because the incentives rewarded it. This is political jujitsu, using your opponent's momentum or the momentum of surrounding headlines to shift the battlefield to terrain where you have the advantage. The significance is simple and profound. We are watching the future of political combat unfold in real time. Hypernarratives, stacked storylines, identity-driven symbolism, weaponized timing. The question isn't whether you approve, the question is whether you understand it. Because people who understand how narratives actually move see political events weeks before they happen. People who don't get blindsided. Trump sent a message with his remarks. Omar sent a message with her rebuttal. Neither message was really about the fraud cases. Both were about who gets to define the meaning of those cases. And here's the cliffhanger, the only question that matters now. When the next major fraud prosecution hits Minnesota, and it will, whose narrative will the country believe? That answer will shape far more than headlines. It will shape political power. And the board is already moving.